This week on The Million Dollar Plan, we are talking healthcare. That's right. It's kind of hard to not talk about healthcare because it's part of our life. We don't know what's going to happen. I don't want to say I'm scared about what's going on, but I definitely feel like I'm in the dark when it comes to healthcare, and I felt that way for several years as we have all these changes. Well, now Congress is voting. They're not voting. There's a plan. It's getting repealed. It's not getting repealed. And when I think of confusion in healthcare, I think of my good friend Paul Ashley, First Person Benefit Advisors. Hello, sir.
Thank you.
You are the first guest at our new studio desk.
This is sturdy. This is meaningful. It's nice.
There's wood.
There's wood.
It's like you're at a Hooters, but there's no wings or harassment.
Or inappropriate clothing, yeah.
Sure. Well, I mean, you can't see below the desk. But
Thank
anyway,
God.
Paul, what in the world is going on?
Yeah. So we've lived under the confusion and complexity of healthcare reform since late 2009 when it passed the Affordable Care Act, the ACA, Obamacare passed in, I guess it would have been March of 10. So the impetulant 7-year-old.
Sure.
And then as Trump ran and the Republicans have talked about for the better part of 7 years, they want to repeal and replace Obamacare. And now that they have the reins in D.C., they're finding out, hey, healthcare is complicated.
Right.
It's hard to deal with.
Yeah.
And they made an initial effort, as we all maybe know, about a month ago, to repeal the Affordable Care Act and replace it with the American Health Care Act, the AHCA.
Yeah, we needed more letters. I
More
think that
acronyms,
was
yeah.
the issue.
Yeah. And the Republicans were smart. They said, listen, we know how to make something better than the Affordable Care Act. We'll just add one letter to the acronym.
So I always feel like when you remember when you were a kid and your parents had certain ways of doing things and you were like, when I'm an adult, I'm going to change that. And then you get to be an adult and then you're like, I can't change that because that's really important.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's the same thing.
Yeah, and that's exactly what they ran into. And the real interesting challenge is there was no thought that any Democrats would cross over. But when you look at the mix of both the House and Senate from a Republican standpoint, what really stood in their way last time when they tried to pass the initial repeal and replace about a month ago was something called the Freedom Caucus.
The Freedom Caucus sounds like, and this is no offense. This is offensive what I'm about to say.
But you don't. I mean, no offense when I say this.
No offense when I say it, but it is offensive.
Yeah.
I don't really want to hang out with anyone that's part of a Freedom Caucus. It sounds a little intense.
Yeah, and I'm confused.
That's offensive.
I thought caucuses could only happen in Iowa, and the fact that they actually exist in D.C. and Congress is totally confusing to me.
Yeah, Freedom Caucus just sounds like we're going to name it like something that we're overselling the idea that we're this group of people.
Yes. And so who is the Freedom Caucus?
Conservative Republicans.
It's the most conservative Republicans in the House and Senate.
Who I don't mind hanging out with.
Yeah, seem to be good people. But so what happened was they felt like the AHCA, which was the proposed Republican legislation, didn't go far enough.
Okay.
And so about a month ago. And so when Speaker Ryan came forward and said, hey, we're going to pull this bill, and he famously said that the Affordable Care Act still remains the law of the land.
Yeah.
It was actually his own House Republicans that put the pause on that, and they went back to the drawing board.
So what's the big beef with Obamacare? There's probably 2 or 3 pieces of this Republicans, we don't like this. What is it?
So the penalties and fees against employers and individuals for not having health care is a big piece.
Okay, so what is the direct replacement of that part of the policy, or is that completely, the whole point is to not have any?
Right, the whole point is to not have any, which creates a revenue challenge. And so one of the things that we've talked about that was likely going to go away was going to be the Cadillac tax. And for folks who aren't familiar, the Cadillac tax is a 40% excise tax on the value over a certain threshold, which was originally supposed to take place headed into 17. It got delayed, and now it's ultimately pushed out to 2020 under the ACA.
Yeah.
The thought was that was going to go away under the Republicans because both Republicans and Democrats actually hated that for different reasons. But now that they need to generate revenue because we're removing other taxes and fees, it looks like the Cadillac tax is actually going to stay in when they score the bill from financial standpoint and budget neutrality.
Yeah, so that brings up another point. This week we saw the first look. We got the first look at the tax reform plan,
Right.
And there's a lot of concern in the retirement plan industry that how this would affect 401k because there's a lot of ambiguity in the language being used as they rolled it out that people are going to lose the tax benefits of potentially traditional IRAs, even Roth IRAs. And so there's a lot of unknown there. And so what you're saying is sort of the unintended consequences of reform is the Cadillac tax that everyone didn't like is now back in the...
It's now back in the mix, at least from a congressional budget office. They score every bill
Sure.
that has an impact on the budget, and they have to have a score of the bill that has some neutrality or is paid for.
Right.
Well, if you take away
You have to pay for stuff?
well, allegedly,
Yeah.
rumor has it.
When did that start?
Yeah, well, apparently never. But there is a need to make this work financially, and it's complicated. I mean, the funny thing is that this reminds me of the thing I know you and I have talked about before. Healthcare is expensive. It is a finite resource, like any other resource on the planet. And whether you believe it's a right or not, it is still not free.
Yeah.
If you believe it's a basic human right, that doesn't change the fact that it has a cost and there's a finite resource to it. And in the United States, we have traditionally rationed that with the deductible of money.
Okay.
In other countries, like Canada or the UK, where they have socialized medicine, they have rationed healthcare with the deductible of time.
Okay. So what do you mean by that? That sounds really good.
Yeah.
I need to
So
understand it now.
So if you think about in Canada, we hear a lot about that. A lot of us have family or neighbors that live
Sure.
up there. Healthcare, quote, is free there.
Yeah.
Right. They do have they have higher taxes, but what happens is for non-emergent services, they don't have to pay, but they may have to wait 6 months for a hip replacement.
Gotcha.
In the United States, you have to pay, but you can get a hip replacement the next day.
So some people in Canada. By the way, have you ever met a Canadian you don't like?
They're all great.
They're all great. I'm sure there's jerk Canadians.
I doubt it. Is there?
I don't know.
And if they were jerk Canadians, they would recognize it and say, "Oh, sorry, so sorry."
So they've become comfortable. I like the they.
Yeah.
The
them.
Canadians have become comfortable with this time deductible, or most people have. Some people have, because some people got to be like, well, I want my hip replacement now.
Right, and so Canadians of means often travel down to the United States with cash in hand and pay for things.
Canadian dollars?
Well, I believe they have to convert it to the U.S. currency.
Okay.
I'm not an expert on currency exchange.
No, sure.
Yeah. But yeah, they come down with their converted Canadian currency and they pay, so they don't have to wait. I mean, I actually had an uncle who lives half the month in Toronto. He's a Canadian citizen.
Okay.
Half the year in Toronto, half the year in Florida. Had to get hip replacement. They said, we've got you scheduled for 8 months. So the guy's in pain. He has no quality of life. So
Right.
he made the decision to take his savings and come down to Florida and have a hip replacement within 2 weeks.
I feel compelled to say it's not unreal. It is unrealistic to expect us to switch to a system like Canada's system. But I have no reason to say that other than I feel compelled to say that.
It would be a massive shift. I think we're more likely long term not to go to socialized medicine, but what is called single payer healthcare.
Okay, I don't understand that. And despite the fact that you've done a great job of explaining it to me several times over the years, what does that? Who's the payer?
So,
Not the employer? What's happening?
so
What's
the,
your
gover-
name?
the government. So if you think about single payer,
Okay.
that's essentially Medicare,
Okay.
which is how seniors
Yes.
get post 65
Sure.
get healthcare in the United States paid for. It's essentially Medicare for all. So that doesn't mean that you don't pay anything. It just means the primary funding source is through the federal government. They collect money from individuals. They collect money from the tax resource.
Okay.
And then what's different about that and socialized medicine is with socialized medicine, the hospitals, the providers, the healthcare apparatus is actually directly employed by the government. With
Oh.
single payer,
No, we don't want that.
with single payer, you still have private market healthcare, and you have private market institutions, insurance companies, and TPAs facilitating
But they're out
the
of it.
single payer, but the government is the funder.
So who's the funder now?
Well, it's a mixed bag right now of healthcare in the United States. It's a combination of individual private pay, private insurance, employer funded, and government funded. Over half the healthcare money spent in the United States is actually already from state and federal government.
How about the general unhealthy nature of Americans in terms of obesity and does that affect this whole discussion?
Well, so if you think about the Affordable Care Act and
Okay.
you think about the proposed and reproposed legislation from the Republican leadership, neither of them do a whole lot to truly address the root cause of why healthcare is expensive in the United States.
Okay.
One of the root causes of why healthcare is expensive is the population health of citizens in the U.S. So it doesn't matter what the unit cost of healthcare is if you don't need to buy the unit cost. So if we could drive down the need and we could be better with primary care and there would be better self-care, then we wouldn't spend as much money in the United States, or if we did, it would be spent at an earlier point more thoughtfully and treat episodes of care versus, wait till people get sick and then treat the symptoms. And so that's an issue. There's no incentive around that. There's no systematic change to that. The other root cause is around why healthcare continues to be expensive and not really addressed well with either bill is efficiencies around technology and leveraging technology. It's one of the most inefficient systems in the world.
Which is
how
crazy.
we deliver healthcare. Yeah, I mean, think about it. You get a test, and then you have to go see another specialist. Sometimes they have to reorder the test, and it's like, why do we not have a repository and information that can be shared?
We will talk about that and more after the break. I also want to talk about, which I love to bring up every time you're on, my family pays $17,000 a year for health care, and it includes 4 wellness appointments. And pretty much that's it. So
That's awesome.
I'm going to complain about that a little bit more after the break. You're listening to The $1 Million Plan. I'm Pete the Planner.
Yeah. Axe hand on the beat. Yes, sir. Glass House. Yes, sir. Mr. Kinetic, Rusty Red and Bob.
We're back here in The $1 Million Plan. I'm Pete the Planner. Paul Ashley, First Person Advisors, joins us.
Hello,
What's
Peter.
your title?
Managing director.
Ho, ho, ho.
Oh,
Jeez.
that and $5 you can buy yourself a Happy Meal with.
But you shouldn't, because it'll make you unhealthy. Paul, we're talking
Yep.
healthcare today. I pay $940 a month for our healthcare, and we make a $6,750 deposit into our HSA every year for a total of, I don't know the math, $17,000 or something like that, $17,000, and we legitimately go to the doctor one time a year each to make sure our parts still work. We're doing it the right way. We're funding our HSA, maxing it out.
Maximizing out.
Huge tax benefit.
Yep.
Good for the long term when we're less healthy. And I would like to make an important point in saying I'm okay to a degree that I'm paying $17,000 a year for nothing.
Well, I think you could argue you're paying $900 a month for what feels like nothing,
Yes.
and the other 67
Okay. Is
is actually you're
Keeping.
you're building your power percentage.
Sure. No, I know. Yes.
Did you see that?
I did like that.
Yeah.
So the question would be, I'm okay with the $900 a month, knowing that other people have coverage that actually need that's the small bit of socialist in me.
Sure, and,
Right.
and you are transferring massive liability risk that you could incur unexpectedly
Right.
to an insurance company. So something totally unexpected happens to you or one of your family members, an accident, a heart attack, I mean, just something, right? An unexpected injury that isn't in your control. And then you then have hundreds of thousands of dollars of bills. Well, you've transferred that risk to the insurance company. So that's part of what you're paying for, but it feels like a racket.
I'm a capitalist.
Yeah.
I am, but I think that fundamentally this is part of the disagreement. Some people are not okay with paying for other people's health care, and other people are.
Yeah,
And
well-
I think I'm okay with that.
When we talk about insurance and transfer of risk, regardless of how it works, the law of large numbers is in play. And the law of large numbers is a principle in any insurance product that the premium of many go to cover the claims of less or few.
Sure.
That's how risk transfer
That's life
works.
insurance, that's
That's
car, automobile
All of
insurance.
it.
Yeah.
Right. So that is what it is. What people really have a beef about when it comes to the health insurance under the Affordable Care Act, primarily in the individual market and in the small groups, so less than 50 employees in most states, is that we went from a risk-based system where younger, healthier people used to pay less and old, sicker people used to pay more.
Sure.
Now we've shrunk that down, and yes, older people still pay a little bit more than young people, but health status doesn't get factored into the underwriting process when you and your family went to buy that $900 policy.
And that's why it went up from like $500 a month to $900 a month over the last couple
right.
years.
And if you were to talk to a similarly healthy older couple that had younger kids,
Sure.
maybe they had kids later in life, but they were 20 years older,
Right.
they are actually paying less than they were prior to the ACA because their age got factored less and maybe health status got factored less. And so what happened was your cost went up, their cost went down. and there's more of a it's called community rating.
Right.
And it's sort of that socialistic, I get why that's okay mindset. What is interesting about the Affordable Care Act is, or about the proposed legislation from the Republicans is, while maybe not at a federal level, they'll take away community rating, they're going to actually kick back likely to each state. This is something they've signaled.
Okay.
They're going to kick back to each state the ability to determine, do they use risk underwriting, which is what we used to have, or stick with the community rating, which is what the ACA
Okay,
has.
so there's risk underwriting or community underwriting?
Community rating, yeah.
Okay, risk underwriting or community rating.
Yes,
Those are the two.
basically.
Is there a hybrid?
I mean, there's like an in-between, which is community rating, but some risk factor only to a certain percentage. So, but what the main difference is will we use health status, and how big of a factor is age and gender?
So when you start using health status, though, that's when you get people who are uninsurable on some level, or they can't afford the coverage based on their health.
Right. So the other thing the Republicans have signaled is we're not gonna take away pre-X or the ability to be rejected for coverage.
Okay.
But we're going to give the insurance market more latitude to charge less for healthy people and charge more for sick people.
So okay, let's take an example of a family making $40,000 a year. Okay, so that is well below the median U.S. household income of $66,000 or $68,000. So 40,000, 3 kids, unhealthy. How in the world are they going to afford increased premiums under what we're talking about?
So 2 things. Number 1, they'll still be insurable,
Okay.
which they've signaled. 2, their costs would likely go up.
Okay.
3, they're proposing that instead of the tax credits and subsidies that people can get when they buy through the exchange, that they'll receive tax credits that come off, that help defray the cost.
Sure.
When you, much like you do with your health savings account,
Okay.
it becomes an above the line deduction and you reduce your tax liability. Same thing is going to happen. They're going to receive tax credits, refundable tax credits.
But I thought with tax reform, we're basically eliminating all deductions and credits.
This might be an exception.
What else? So does that mean each state, like, is it the legislature that'll say we're going to be a risk underwriting versus the community thing?
Yeah, and in coordination with each state's Department of Insurance.
Oh.
So, yeah, so the
Okay.
Department of Insurance, each state has their own Department of Insurance.
Sure.
So the Indiana Department of Insurance, the IDOI, works directly with the governor's office and the state legislature to pass and change different regs and laws related to insurance product and oversight in the state of Indiana. So if the federal government says it's no longer a federal law that community rating has to exist, it now can be determined at the state level, which is really what it used to be.
So is it going to be based on whether you're a red state or a blue state?
It could be, yeah, or other economic factors. I would think that more Republican-leaning states are going to go back to the way
risk.
it used to be,
Yeah.
the red states, and the more Democrat-leading states or the blue are going to maybe keep community rating.
I have to admit, this really feels like the heart of disagreement between a conservative and a liberal mindset, right? Sort of the Republican principles and Democratic principles. Like this, when you really break it down the way you have, I was going to say we have, but I haven't really added to the
You've asked
conversation.
really
Man, I
good
felt that
questions.
I've asked some pretty dumb questions. I really feels like it's the heart of this, right? It's
Yeah.
like, on what side is the incentive? Is the incentive to be healthy and make a great living? Sort of the trickle-down economics of the GOP platform versus, hey, we should help everybody.
Yeah, and it's at the core there is it a basic human right or not, or to what level is it a basic human right?
That's a tough question.
And how do you fund wherever you fall on that spectrum?
So let's go off track because it wouldn't be the show if we didn't. I saw Senator Bernie Sanders just tweeted this week that it is a fundamental human right to make more than $15 an hour. That's sort of a weird statement, right? I mean, because if you overuse fundamental human right as a reason for something to be, it sort of loses its power.
And then has downstream intended and unintended consequences. I'll give an example that's related to that. That's a Sanders piece. It seems like the state of New York is moving to free public education.
Okay. Yeah.
Right?
Call that.
Free public college education. So what are some unintended consequences of that? I believe that private institutions are going to see significant pressure because quality students that used to go to private institutions in New York might now choose the free path at the state institution. So they're going to be having a harder time getting students to come and the tuition and scholarship money that follows. The other unintended consequence is as you make things free and disconnect the consumer from the end user, then costs tend to go up because there's not a direct, which is what we have in healthcare, by the way. Back in the 1980s and early 90s when we moved to managed care, the HMO type model, and we made a doctor's office be, in the consumer's mind, a $10 copay.
Right.
Well, that's not the true cost of a doctor's visit.
Yeah.
That's what you paid, but that's not what the actual cost is.
So people weren't being good healthcare consumers because they're like, well, it's just $10.
It's just $10. So, again, the New York example, if we make public university and college education free in New York, I'm not saying that's wrong or right. I'm just saying what's the unintended consequence of that?
So
same thing happened in healthcare.
So okay, I like this conversation, and we're going to have it for about 30 more seconds before we go to break. I guess we'll just leave. We'll leave it hanging. We'll pick it up in the next segment. But so for the people on the other side of the argument, when we say something like, "Hey, there's unintended consequences," prices are going to keep going up for everybody else. When we have, and then they say, "Well, I don't care." But what's that argument? I'm curious. What we're going to come back to the break is beyond "I don't care" of the unintended consequences. There has to be some way for that side of the argument to deal with it. So, if you're just joining us, great, we're going to commercial. But we're talking to Paul Ashley, managing director at First Person, talking healthcare, what's going on right now, and we'll do that more here after the break. This is the $1 Million Plan, and I'm Pete the Planner. We're back with Paul Ashley, Managing Director of First Person here in the $1 Million Plan, talking healthcare. So a couple things. When we make healthcare free, when we make college free, the unintended consequences are that prices are going to continue to rise because the funding sources have shifted, much in the way student loans have made the price of college go up because there's readily available funds to send people to college. For those people, most people acknowledge that. Right? And the right side of the aisle says this is a problem. What's the left side of the aisle say to that?
I think the left side of the aisle says, let's shift this to, this is a basic human right.
And then it gets back into this, what are the human rights?
Right, it's a basic human right, and we as a nation need to come forward and pay for this. And whatever that looks like, no American should go without the ability to access and pay for healthcare.
So
that disagreement,
Yeah.
that disagreement is at the core of, is it a basic human right and how do we fund it?
This is how I know I'm in the middle, because I think to be far on the right, you're saying, well, it's obvious, this is the way it is. And to be far on the left is like, this is obvious, this is the way it is. And I think we started our segment today with saying, this is really a complicated issue.
Massive. So healthcare makes up about somewhere just shy of 20% of the GDP in the United States, the gross domestic product. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about
what percent?
About 20%, just slightly less. So 20% of our economy is wrapped up in healthcare. That's a massive
huge
amount of money. And so to move the needle, to change a system, we're talking about billions and trillions of dollars that affect everybody is touched by healthcare in one way or another.
This goes without saying, but it doesn't really help when the president says things like, this is easy, we're going to do it, and it'll be a lot better. And everyone, I mean, to trivialize it down to a level which it can't be, because it is, and I also see there's just no compromise going on right now. I think to get anywhere, that we're going to have to find compromise. Now tell us how this affects Medicaid, because from what I understand, there's a pretty big impact.
Yeah, there's a huge impact. Indiana actually sits in an interesting position for that too. So let's talk about the general impact. So Medicaid, not to be confused with Medicare. Medicare is for seniors and disabled persons. Medicaid is a federally funded, state-funded program run by each state.
Sure.
So each state has their own version of Medicaid. And the Affordable Care Act pushed expansion of Medicaid. Each state made a different decision. What the Republicans are proposing is going to pull back some of that funding, and then states are going to have to make potentially new decisions, either step up and continue to insure the folks they had through the federal funded expansion, or pull back. And one of the things that, for good or bad, love it or hate it, that the Affordable Care Act definitely did, is we took the uninsured population from north of 20 to just south of 10%. So you say, oh, it's a success. Well, maybe. And a lot of that was due to Medicaid expansion. So if we fund Medicaid differently, you're going to see the uninsured begin to rise in certain states who change their policies. Now that has an impact on everybody because the uninsured goes up. That means that hospitals and providers are having to do free care.
Right.
And then that translates to them wanting to pass on costs to private pay and insured individuals and employer-funded plans. So it's all part of the system, right? What is interesting about Indiana is under the Affordable Care Act, we took our original HIP program, the Healthy Indiana Plan, and created HIP 2.0,
Okay.
which you hear a lot about. It's in the
Yeah.
news. They're doing a good job marketing it. And what HIP 2.0 is the way we in Indiana chose to expand Medicaid, but do it in a more consumer-based way that put choice and power in the consumer's hands, gave them what's called a power account, which is essentially a health savings account, and made a sliding scale of payment. So we didn't do a carte blanche expansion of Medicaid like some other states. We did a more thoughtful consumer-based way, and it's working pretty well.
So if this sort of we go this direction and it falls back more on the states, this could end up bankrupting a tremendous number of states.
Correct. So what's interesting about Indiana, our example, if the funding mechanism changes, our example probably still stands and doesn't have to have massive tweaks.
Okay. So wouldn't everyone just adopt our methodology?
Interesting.
Yeah.
So one of the key architects of HIP 2.0,
It was Mike Pence, right?
yes, but the actual boots on the ground
Yeah.
architect was a woman named Seema Verma.
That Seema Verma.
Yes, and Seema Verma is now the director of the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, appointed by
Federally.
Trump federally.
Okay.
So she has a knowledge of how HIP 2.0 works. If the funding mechanism at the federal level changes, states are going to be coming to her and other states to learn how do we do, what do we do now that we're holding this bag? And so Indiana, interestingly, is going to likely be an example of how to do Medicaid in your state without bankrupting under the new financial regulations.
So it's quite obvious, and you understand this more than just about anybody. I mean, it's definitely more than most consumers, most employers. Your job is to help employers
Yep.
understand it. That's what you all do. What do you think is going to happen? Or do you have to throw in the wild card? We're talking about politics.
Yeah, we're talking about politics, and as we record this today, the Republicans have just delayed another vote. They've kicked it to quote next week, and who knows what's going to happen quote next week. Next week could be next week.
But they're just, I mean, and this is obvious, but it's worth stating. At this point, they're completely ignoring the Democrats because what's it really matter? They're going to vote against whatever's coming.
Pretty much.
So they're just working. The GOP is just working it out amongst themselves, trying to get the Freedom Caucus back.
But they also, if they go too far,
Yeah.
now they run the risk of taking the moderate Republicans and whatever they would name their caucus,
Yeah.
and losing them. So
Yeah.
they've got to move it farther to the right, but they can't go so far to the right that they lose the moderate Republicans.
So what's going to happen?
So what's going to happen? So the original draft of the AHCA signaled a couple things, a few things we've already talked about. How they fund Medicaid is definitely on the table. Repealing the employer mandate, likely repealing the employee mandate. Now, things that probably won't change, they'll still have no pre-existing conditions, guaranteed insurability, adult child coverage up to age 26,
Sure.
preventive care required, because these are market reforms that have taken place that have largely been like, that actually worked.
Yeah.
They were part of the ACA, and to pull those back now would probably be pretty short-sighted. And so they've signaled those will stay. Some other changes, they're likely to make the health savings accounts, which you and I have always
Loved.
beat the drum of. HSAs are going to be easier to buy, more latitude under what plan design you can have, and also be health savings account compatible and get the tax benefits and the long-term savings benefits. The Medicaid changes.
So something's going to happen.
Something's going to happen. Absolutely.
So when you hear the
For employers, by the way, that are listening to this, one of the things we believe is going to happen, and by the way, technically, this may have already happened in a practical standpoint. One of the very first things Trump did, I think it was the day he was inaugurated, or the next day, he signed an executive order that said, relax the enforcement of the Affordable Care Act. And so the tax penalties and reporting things, if people don't do it, then there's maybe no teeth of enforcement.
Deregulation.
Deregulation, yeah.
Last question before we go to break, and then we come back and wrap this up. When the president says Obamacare is collapsing, it's a disaster. Like, what does collapsing Obamacare mean?
He's partially onto something, actually. So when he says Obamacare is collapsing, what he's talking about is the state and federal-based exchanges.
Okay.
So what's happened is as insurers, so private insurers are the ones that are filing products to be in the federal exchange in
Right.
Indiana or the Kentucky-based exchange.
They've stopped filing them, right?
Where they've stopped filing and they pulled out of the market. Like
Yeah.
United Healthcare pulled out of almost every state except for maybe 3 or 4. Humana pulled out, right? There's an area in Kentucky near, or not Kentucky, Tennessee near Chattanooga, where there's like 6, 7 counties that literally have no options.
Yeah.
So if you live in that county, you go to the exchange based on the zip code and where you live, you can't buy.
Okay.
And so what's happening is the private market insurers are pulling out because the funding mechanism's changing. Not enough healthy people are buying into the individual
Yeah.
exchanges. It's only the sick and previously uninsured. And it just, the law of large numbers is not working on their behalf. So because they're a private market,
Yeah.
they're like, we're out. We've got shareholders we have to deliver a return on. And so they pull out and it is slowly collapsing. Now, the Trump administration can do things to make the collapse either happen slower or not happen or happen faster.
But they're letting it.
They're letting it happen.
happen,
Of course
yeah.
they are.
All right. So here's what we're going to do. We'll take one final break, come back, wrap this whole thing up with Paul Ashley, Managing Director of First Person Advisors. This is the $1 Million Plan. I'm Pete the Planner.
Yeah. Axe hand on the beat.
All right, wrapping up this week's $1 Million Plan with Pete the Planner. I'm no Blom this week. No biggest waste of money. Why? More important things to talk about. Paul Ashley, Managing Director of First Person's back with us. FLSA, Fair Labor Standards Act.
Yep.
What's happening there?
So there's a lot of talk. The Fair Labor Standards Act is a massive law. A lot of talk last year and really the 2 years leading up to it. On December 1st of 2016, there was a new overtime rule that was supposed to take effect.
And then it got suspended, right?
It got there was an federal court injunction placed on it. And so what was supposed to happen was a lot of changes, but the main thing that was affecting employers and their employees was those individuals that were exempt from overtime had to have a certain set of rules, but then also have a certain salary threshold.
Okay.
That salary threshold was getting moved effective December 1st from about $23,000 a year to just over $47,000 a year. That's a massive change.
Yeah.
Now you're thinking, well, there's not that many salary people that are below that threshold, but nonprofits, people that are in middle management positions
Sure.
early in their career, to make less than $47,000 is possible, but still be exempt from overtime. So what they're saying is, you make $41,000 a year, you're a salaried employee. All of a sudden, they're telling the employer as of 12/1 of 16, they have to at least make $47,700. Massive change.
Yeah.
Right. So they either need to move them to hourly, where they have to clock their hours, which has a cultural challenge,
Yeah.
or bump up their salary to get above that income threshold, which has a financial challenge. And what happened was a district court in Texas basically put an injunction on that, kicked the can, and then the Obama administration, prior to leaving, then did an appeal. That appeal then is sitting in court, but guess who administration is now in charge of that appeal? The Trump administration. They're probably going to drop that appeal, and now the injunction is going to hold for a while, and we won't have a change to overtime rules. Practically speaking, most employers, because it happened at the 11th hour, most employers already made changes, and they're just there now, and they're following a law they don't need to.
Well, it's like the fiduciary rule with
Yes.
the Department of Labor. It's the same thing. It's
The
like
F word.
all these changes were made, and then it was like, no, not happening.
Yeah.
And then
I think the theme here is the practical application of massive rules in DC and how people don't really understand what works on Main Street.
Yeah.
And it just creates a hot mess for employers and the employees, and it's a challenge.
And it's also the whole argument between regulation and deregulation, right? It's just like, should we regulate? I don't want to say regulate morality, because that's not where we're going, but we're almost going with regulating sort of social norms as it relates to compensation and healthcare and those sorts of things.
And how you board people on airplanes.
Paul Ashley, Managing Director of First Person, thank you for joining us. First guest at the new desk.
It's nice.
It is great. Now when I say knock on wood, it's legitimately wood. All right, that's all we have time for this week. Thanks for joining us. Go to PeteThePlanner.com for more. If you want to watch this episode and see what we're knocking on, PeteThePlanner.com. TV. Go to firstpersonadvisors.com to learn more about the good folks at First Person and Paul Ashley. Until next time, I'm sending you good vibes because good vibes are all that's in the budget. I'm Pete the Planner. This is $1 Million Plan.
This is where I came from. Planet Lovetron, where we drop love bombs, funk missiles, and live in soul shelters. No helter skelter. The heat don't swelter because everybody stays cool. Left many moons ago to bring the philosophies of my ancestors to another place. God picked the third rock, gave me to my earth family, and told me to create. And so I am. Pen in my hand, microphone on the stand. Over vinyl, I command and demand magnificence in an instance. I can make you dance, cry, or love. Fly as a dove, released from Everest. The fresh is fresh, and you can call me E.T. Word to John Tesh. Let me bless this harmonic presentation. It's amazing, so amazing. I'm the reason. Salutations, I bring you Lovetron greetings from a faraway land. I am the soul controller. Put the remote down and let me take control. You're now a part of my zone, so enjoy yourself. Lovetron can restore your health. I bring you greetings, salutations. How you doing? And is that how y'all say it? The tinkling of the keys is an homage to the little star. I sojourn over poetic descriptions of sound and travel to my other world. Out of this world, spaceship on my arm took me home, fueled by the ink and the megabytes and the hypertext transfer protocol, stronger than the Skynet and the Terminator. I push faders into warp speed, glide with ease, creating a breeze they call a black hole. Event horizon, no rear view concerns. This I adjourn, in beats I burn. This I adjourn, in beats I burn. Salutations, I bring you Lovetron greetings from a faraway land. I am the soul controller. Put the remote down and let me take control. You're now a part of my zone, so enjoy yourself. Lovetron can restore your health. I bring you greetings, salutations. How you doing? And is that how y'all say it?